have been a thorny combination for many years. Among the most advanced and controversial developments are genetically modified crops. Supporters say they can help feed the world as they are more disease resistant and produce better yields. Opponents to all this technology say they threaten the natural environment and describe them as Frankenstein foods. We'll discuss the ethical issues raised by all these developments in a moment, but first let's hear from a scientist creating GM food, including purple tomatoes. Professor Cathy Martin is a scientist at the John Innes Centre in Norwich, where they are currently carrying out a number of projects involving genetically modified food. One of the ideas the centre is working on is to see if they can implant the nitrogen-storing qualities of pea plants into cereal crops. It's hoped the 5-year project will have benefits for farmers in the developing world, meaning they can use less expensive nitrogen fertiliser, saving them money and causing less pollution.
Introducing nitrogen fixation into corn and wheat cannot be done by conventional breeding. There isn't the genetic information there within those species to do that. It has to be done by genetic engineering.
Professor Martin is lead scientist on a project where genes have been added to the common tomato, which may create extra health benefits. That's produced a crop of purple tomatoes.
The reason that we have done this genetic modification is to improve the content of these pigments because they have health properties. So let me just show you this in some more detail. So this is a regular tomato, which everyone must be familiar with, and this is a purple tomato, and you can see it's full of these natural colours. So we believe that this is a beneficial property that will help people if we can try and produce tomatoes that are enriched so that people don't have to eat quite so many fruit and vegetables to get these essential nutrients.
The production of GM food can be a sensitive ethical area because of concerns about the introduction of such crops into the natural environment.
I can understand people being concerned about what we do, and I certainly approve of regulatory scrutiny so that people can be sure that what we produce is not dangerous and is not uncontrollable in some way. I would like to give people the choice to choose crops, plants, food that's improved, but I don't want to force it on anyone that doesn't think that it will be beneficial.
Professor Martin is determined to carry on her work because she believes it holds the key to solving some of the world's food problems.
I think that scientifically it's very challenging, but the potential is so huge and the benefits could be absolutely enormous. And I think that that's a challenge worth taking.
Professor Cathy Martin there on one form of genetic modification. So is GM and the synthetic biology of growing cultured meat a logical ascent of science or a slippery slope? Do you think, Joanna, it's going too far?
Well, some scientists are making very exaggerated claims for how they can improve on natural foods. And in the case of the purple tomatoes, we already have improved purple tomato seeds on the market now that have been developed by conventional breeding methods without any of the risks attached to GM. And the three key ones are the possible threat to animal and human health, environmental problems, and risking the future security of our food supplies.
Well, we'll discuss those in more depth shortly, but that's the question for our text vote. Is science going too far with our food? Text the word vote followed by yes or no to 81771. Texts will be charged at your standard message rate. You can only vote once. Go online to vote for free, and results will be announced at the end of the show. And visit bbc.co.uk/Sunday Morning Live, where you can also read full terms and conditions. Nick, would you like the idea of a cultured beef burger with some purple tomato on top?
No, when you go that far, of course, that beef burger for £200,000 is obviously nuts, or probably not because you'd be allergic. But if I was to actually rephrase the question, so has scientists gone too far? Yes, making tomatoes like that, possibly, or making beef burgers. But if I was to say, what about making your shopping cheaper? Or what about stopping starvation across the world? Or what about putting some kind of nutrients or supplements into your children's food that will make them healthier? That is how I think we should be looking at that issue. In a perfect world, we'd all have a little meadow and the runner beans would be growing there and little perfect carrots and potatoes, and the children would be gambling merrily, picking gooseberries and elderflowers that we'd all make into a pressé for that evening.
This is an anecdote from your family life, clearly.
That is not like it. We all live in big cities where there isn't enough room. One thing we can't do across the whole of the world is build more land. There'll never be more land. There will be more people. We've got to find a solution.
Before we get into the details of the claims being made for it, I mean, Vicky, I'm interested that for many people who object to the idea of this manipulation with foods, there seems to be an instinctive revulsion. Why is that? Is it because it's food rather than something that's medical?
Well, I think we see it in every area where technology advances. There is this yuck factor, and even academics call it that, where we're kind of repulsed by something initially and then it becomes very, very normal. So we saw it with heart transplants, we saw it with IVF. We'd all be very familiar and comfortable, and largely society is positive about these things now. But you always kind of come up against these initial barriers where we think we've gone too far. And I think part of the yuck factor might come from food that's produced in a laboratory. But all you have to do is look on the back of a Diet Coke can, tell me if you can actually pronounce anything on there, and tell me that wasn't produced in a laboratory. And a lot of those yuck factors already begin to be shown up for what they are. I think they're temporary, and I think they will fade.
I mean, Joanna, it's interesting. If it was skin that you were growing, which I think they do now, you know, from stem cells, for medical grafting, would you feel differently about that to the idea of growing cultured meats?
Well, I think we have to look at the track record of these, you know, great promises. The promises are sort of the blind will see, the lame will walk. But what the reality is, if we take GM crops for a minute, is that they've created super weeds, super pests that no one knows what to do anything about. They've polluted land where they weren't meant to be. They haven't produced the yields that farmers were promised. As a result, a lot of farmers have lost money and desperately want to get out of the technology. So I think, like Nick says, we have to get out of our little fantasy world. Everyone wants a fairy wand that makes everything all right. We have to look at the track record of these results. On the lab meat, we know already that it doesn't have the nutritional qualities of conventional meat. Now, we don't know if that will then have knock-on effects for allergies or effects on the people who eat it. This is huge territory. And I think we need to be very cautious when we decide that we know better than nature.
But isn't regulation supposed to take care of that?
How are you going to feed the world then?
Well, you're more likely to feed the world
But
with conventional...
we haven't got enough land for all the people
We
in
have got
the
enough
starving.
food. There is
People
enough
are
food
starving
out
in
there.
Africa
There
every
is enough
minute.
food for everybody in the world right now. So
No, there isn't. There are people starving in Africa as I
There is enough
speak.
food. The Enough Food If
Yeah,
campaign
Vicky
launched this
says-
summer.
Well, hang on a second. Why are we giving all this money to charity
Abundance
then?
is not actually going to fix selfishness. So even, and I'm very pro-technology, if we do create masses of food, it doesn't solve the fact that it will be
Why are
monopolised.
people starving? What's gone wrong?
Because
Joanna
we have
answer.
a lot of a few very powerful companies who basically manipulate the world's food supply for their profit. It's about the distribution of food and equality and public ownership of food. When you have local communities with control and owning their own food supply, then you have a healthy system for feeding the world. What we have at the moment is profit-driven attempt to patent magic bullets that can't deliver.
I don't understand.
Sorry.
Neither do you either.
No,
I mean,
I
there
don't
are.
understand
That
what
is
you
why
mean,
you.
no.
Well, that is why we need crops like this. You go into an area where presumably there are parts of Africa, right, where you can't grow anything. If we get this absolutely right, suddenly it'll be fantastic. They'll have vines and God knows what else.
Drought-resistant crops,
They'll be resistant to all these
let's
sort of...
take that example.
Yeah, it'll be fantastic.
Drought-resistant crops.
Yeah, drought-resistant.
Conventional breeders are breeding quite effectively drought-resistant crops.
Right.
We've got all sorts of different
Well,
kinds
they're not doing very
of
well,
crops.
are they?
Well, no, I really do need to listen. We have crops that have been improved. We have sweet potato with more beta-carotene. We have the purple tomatoes with extra anthocyanins. We have higher yielding wheat. In Britain, we have, in Wales, in fact, we have bred potatoes, which are blight resistant, all with non-GM using natural systems.
I'm not so worried about Wales. I'm more worried about Ethiopia.
Okay, well, I tell you what,
that's a fake argument, really.
Let's bring in Professor Kalestas Juma from the International Development, he's a Professor of International Development at the Harvard Kennedy School in America, and he joins us from Addis Ababa. You know, there is this concern about whether this technology is really about helping small farmers in the developing world, or is it just about big companies making profits?
Thank you so much for having me on the program. That is a concern that was raised 17 years ago, legitimately, because the first crops were commercialized by large farms. 17 years later, the evidence doesn't support that claim at all. There's about 170 million hectares grown worldwide of GM crops. 52% of that is grown in developing countries. If you look at the economic benefits, GM crops have added nearly $100 billion to global agriculture. Just over 50% of that has gone to developing countries. If you look at the number of farmers involved, there's about 117 million farmers involved in production of GM crops. Out of that, 90% is small-scale farmers and mostly in developing countries. So the claim that it doesn't help developing countries is 17 years old and doesn't have any support today.
Professor Juma, what about the question that Joanna raised, which is, couldn't a lot of this be done through conventional breeding of species rather than genetic manipulation, and the fear that there are unknown consequences of this? Superweeds are some of those signs that perhaps we don't know what we're doing.
Yeah, I think that the issue here is looking at this as a generic argument rather than looking at specific modifications that are being done to solve specific problems. If you have a pest that buries itself inside your crop as the corn borer, it's very difficult to solve that problem without having to go through genetic modification. There may be other areas where you can use conventional plant breeding methods, and that's all being done. Our position has always been that we should leave all the options open. But the critics of biotechnology have always said, let's have all options except biotechnology. And that is not logical in my view.
Thank you. I just want to get Joanna to respond to that. Thank you, Professor Juma.
I think it's interesting what Professor Juma is saying. I mean, the thing is that, interestingly, in India, very different experience. If you were to speak to many scientists about GM crops, they'd talk about the disaster of BT cotton there, which has really impoverished farmers and hasn't delivered the yields that people were promised. In Indonesia, just this week, farmers were ripping up crops, GM crops, because they're so concerned about how it will affect their livelihood. So I think it would be wrong to suggest that there is some sort of empirical, sound, flawless evidence to suggest that genetic modification works. I think that's your view, and I respect it, but I don't think necessarily that other people in other countries, not least America, where farmers are actually trying to get out of these crops and they're trying to get them labelled. Consumers want them labelled because they know they don't want to eat them any longer.
Professor Juma, your response briefly?
Yeah, could I respond to the specific India case?
Sure.
I oversaw the production of a study done on India on BT cotton that was published by the National Academy of Sciences. I coordinated the review process. And the evidence from India does not support that claim. In fact, over the last 10 years or so, the evidence shows that BT cotton has increased yields by up to 24% by controlling the pests. Farmers have had at least 50% gain in profits, and the same farmers have had up to 18% increase in consumption expenditures to them.
All right.
So the evidence does not support that claim. That's actually a claim that was made around 2001 when there was crop failure in cotton.
Right. Can I interrupt?
To be
Professor Juma,
basically perpetuated, but the evidence doesn't support it.
Yeah, I'm afraid we can't get into the kind of details of specific evidence. I know it's all disputed, but thank you very much, Professor Juma, for joining us. I'd like to bring in now Tom McMillan, who's from the Soil Association, which represents organic growers. There is this idea that perhaps GM science has moved on, as Professor Juma was saying, and that perhaps the fears of it are stuck in the past.
Well, I think people have been sceptical rather than afraid, and sceptical of the promises that have been made for the past 15 years about GM feeding the world, and also why we're being asked to grow and to eat crops when the overwhelming push for the technology has come from chemical and seed companies wanting to gain greater control over the seed market. And as Joanna mentioned, the experience, particularly from the US, is that skepticism has been pretty well placed. So we've had a lot of GM crops growing there. We've seen herbicide use go up when we were promised it would go down. We've seen superweeds emerge, so weeds that resist those herbicides. We've seen seed prices go up, so $100 more per hectare for the GM varieties than the non-GM. At the same time, yields have level pegged with Europe, where we haven't been using GM. Companies are suing farmers left, right, and centre when the seeds escape into neighbouring fields, and they're not accepting any liability for any of the problems that result. And meanwhile, conventional breeding's been churning out many of the benefits GM promised.
Nick, I mean, has that changed your view at all?
No. I am totally informed by what I heard from your professor. I didn't know that we were going to Addis Ababa. It was truly extraordinary because I was talking about Ethiopia. It seems interesting that where there is resistance, it's countries like America, and we're sitting here in the UK having a conversation where we're all quite well off, thank you very much. I'm far more informed from the words we had from the professor.
Vicky, I was wondering if, you know, there is this idea that perhaps GM worries are a luxury we can't afford. I mean, kind of Nick's point about there is a real issue about food shortages, even if part of the issue is the way that businesses operate.
Yes, I think so. And I think we need to push past the yuck factor and the panic. And I think some of the terminology we use, even like superweeds, I would compare that to Franken crops, which is another term used of GM food, you know, the kind of Frankenstein model. I think we need to remember actually that what we're dealing with are things that will become very, very normal. I would actually compare superweeds to the trolls of the internet. We wouldn't stop using social media because of trolls. You know, we're not going to let the bad parts put us off the good. Technology is more or less a neutral tool. We use it for good or bad. There will always be problems. We can't let those stop us.
Joanna.
Yeah, but Vicky, what would you call a weed that is resistant to all the strongest pesticides that can be heaped on it?
Well, then I would also call the crops themselves super crops, because that's the same terminology.
Well, not
we
really,
don't call them super crops, we call them
creating
Franken crops.
a new breed of weed.
Which is
and a new breed of crop.
So what you're going to do, just put, you know, heap in stronger and stronger pesticides. How are you? But it can't be done, Nick.
Listen,
that's reading book one. You need to move on to reading book two.
I want to bring in another contributor.
Do you use deep freezer? Do you use frozen
This
food?
is a silly question. I can see where you're
So
going.
this is the argument. Refrigeration is manipulated.
It is the same thing.
No, that's a natural thing. You know,
do you use a freezer?
Inuit people have been, you know,
I sense you do use a freezer, and you know therefore that sometimes things have to be put into food.
It's an artificial argument.
Right,
That's
well,
a natural process.
Well, I want to bring in someone else on this issue, which is Claire Robinson, who's the editor of GM Watch, who, which reports on concerns around GM food. You know, it is interesting, this argument that's made that things like refrigeration are interventions in nature, and that perhaps, you know, this blanket objection to bioengineering is a false one. What's your view?
Well, I think that when we're considering technologies, we have to think whether they really offer progress. And I really don't call superweeds and toxic effects that GM crops have had for the poultry animals, I really don't call that. Plus, the latest data says that European non-GM agriculture
I'm afraid, I'm really sorry, Claire, I'm not able to make out what you're saying. So do you want to, I think we'll just have to come back, but it is this idea, you know, that there are reasons to fear bioengineering because it's going into unknown territory of a different kind to something like refrigeration or medical intervention.
I'm going to pick up a little bit on what Vicky said. We probably wouldn't have cars. We certainly wouldn't have trains. We wouldn't have, the idea when they first invented trains, no one should go on because we were all going to die of heart attacks. God knows what it was like when we had aircraft. The world does move.
It's the same with the invention of the printing press. You know,
right.
You
could
ruin
stop
society.
using those things. I mean, Joanna's argument is about whether you're changing nature.
You're changing nature.
Fundamentally.
But we have
without
done
knowing
before
the
to
consequences.
our benefit in the fields of health.
It's incremental.
You haven't ever swapped genetic material over species barrier.
How do you feel about IVF? I mean, that was, you know, playing God. That's how it was.
Can we actually stick? I mean, this is what the sort of pro-GM and pro sort of lab meat people always do. They always want to change the argument. They don't want to talk about food. They want to talk about trains, boats, planes, deep freezes.
Well, no,
we
deep
have
freeze
to
is
look at the reality.
Look,
it is
frozen, Nick, frozen. Freezing is something that nature does. You know, there are such things as you know, ice is a natural thing.
I know, but it doesn't last forever, does it?
Can I give you just a different example to end on? I was listening to an interview with the scientists who's developed cultured leather, where they're growing cow cells and they're creating a substitute for leather. Now, that's an animal product, but we don't eat it. I wonder, is that different? Would you be not out of an objection to that?
Well, I don't know about cultured leather. I do know a bit about cultured meat, and the problem there is that first of all, the muscle cells have to come from cows. But secondly, the nutrient broth to encourage those strips of meat protein to grow has to come from fetuses of cows. So you need a massive livestock industry to just keep the test tube industry producing the nutrient broth.
Well, that's the final question, Vicky. Are we looking at things the wrong way around? Instead of thinking, how do we create more meat, let's grow it artificially. I mean, the Green Party is talking about a meat-free day a week to reduce meat consumption because it is so intensive on agricultural crops.
That's another way around it, but if we do want to be able to have enough protein and we want to access it through meat, I think we should use technology to push those boundaries. I also think it's interesting, if you are a vegetarian on cruelty grounds, you could potentially eat one of these beef burgers. My best friend's a vegetarian, so perhaps she could enjoy a good barbecue. So
There's a challenge for me as well. I'm trying to work out if I'd be allowed to as a vegetarian. Thank you. We have to leave it there.